I want you to listen to this video by Christian podcaster Bryce Crawford, and then I'm going to offer some thoughts in response.
Is homosexuality a sin? It is a sin, but it's no more a sin than it is to get angry at a brother in your heart. It's no more than a sin than to look at a woman or a man with lustful intent in your heart. It's no more than a sin to lie to your brother or to take something that's not been given to you. All sin separates us from God. And whether someone struggles with sexuality, their temper, substance abuse, it doesn't make you or I morally greater than them. And that's freeing to look at our brothers and sisters and say, man, our brothers and sisters are sick. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in Exodus and they looked on it to be healed, so the Son of Man was lifted up. And as people who are sick with sin in our heart, if we look to the Son of Man, we can be healed and saved.
Okay, so here's the question addressed in this video. Is all sin the same? Or another way we might ask this question is, are there degrees of sin? Well, yes and no. It depends on what you mean by that. Wayne Grudem does a good job of addressing this question in his book, Systematic Theology. And what Grudem says there is that we need to differentiate between two consequences of sin. Number one, our legal guilt before God. And number two, the consequences of sin in our life and our relationship with God. Now, when it comes to our legal guilt before God, Bryce is exactly right when he states,
all sin separates us from God.
But there is another aspect of sin we need to look at as well, and that has to do with the consequences of sin in our life and relationship with God. And in that sense, some sin is worse than other sin. The idea that there are degrees of seriousness when it comes to sin is attested to all throughout Scripture. Jesus taught this when he stood before Pilate, and in John 19:11 said this, "He who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Even in the Old Testament, there are different penalties for different sins. If all sin is the same, why did God prescribe different punishments for different sins? In the Ten Commandments, the sixth commandment is do not murder, and the eighth commandment is do not steal. But murder is worse than stealing. And God prescribed worse penalties for worse sins. So when Christians say things like, well, all sin is the same, or we're all just sinners, that's true, but it's only half the story. When you think about these types of moral issues, try changing the moral topic that is under discussion and see if the statements still ring true. Or see if you have certain moral intuitions that rise to the surface and say, that doesn't sound right. For example, suppose that instead of addressing homosexuality, Bryce was talking about rape, and he got on his podcast and he said something like this: is rape a sin?
It is a sin, but it's no more a sin than it is to get angry at a brother in your heart. It's no more than a sin than to look at a woman or a man with lustful intent in your heart. It's no more than a sin to lie to your brother or to take something that's not been given to you.
No, actually, rape is worse. Rape is worse than stealing a candy bar. This is something that we recognize even within our own legal system. The reason we have different punishments for different crimes is not because all crime is the same in the sense that it makes us guilty, but rather some crime is worse than other crime in the sense of the harm it causes, with regard to its lasting effects, and with regard to the level of moral depravity. And this is why even in the Old Testament, God prescribes different punishments for different offenses, even though each of those offenses would make one legally guilty before God. So it's important that we recognize both truths. It's true that all sin separates us from God. It's also true that some sin is worse than other sin. But Christians often emphasize the first without teaching the second. Why is that? Well, at one point in the video, Bryce says this:
it doesn't make you or I morally greater than them.
This, I think, is what Christians are trying to avoid. I think Christians sometimes are so worried about appearing judgmental or of displaying an attitude of moral superiority. And it's true we don't want to slide into judgmentalism. However, we also want to be biblical in our approach to sin and recognize the fact that some sin is more displeasing to God. So we can hold these three things to be true at the same time. Number one, all sin separates us from God. Number two, some sin is worse than other sin in terms of depravity, in terms of consequences, and in terms of life results. And number 3, no one stands before God as morally praiseworthy, but rather we are all saved by grace through faith.